systematic campaign. It's not just like, oh, we'll fire some missiles at a bridge and whatever. They're thinking through which bridges they want to hit. They're thinking through where the vulnerabilities are. So I think one of them, for example, was the Chonhar Bridge, right, which they have hit on several occasions. Now, there is one pro-Ukraine group, Crimean Wind, which says almost all the bridges are blown up and Crimea is already cut off. I need corroboration on that. I think what you have got from verified war monitors is that the traffic is way down between southern Russia, occupied southern Ukraine, and then Crimea. We also know from Crimean authorities they're sounding a bit desperate now. Um, the gasoline rationing is now well in place with almost every gasoline or petrol station, if you will, across Crimea. That's 20 liters per week, 5.3 gallons. Uh, that's not enough for a lot of people to get by on a week-to-week basis, and that means anyone in Crimea is going to struggle to get out just because of the gasoline situation. We know that Russia is in discussions about how much they continue to relocate the Black Sea Fleet from Crimea to southern Russia, probably to Novorossiysk. That has been under discussion for some time. All of that being said, you have to remember how symbolically important Crimea is for the Kremlin. You know, this was the start of their war on Ukraine to be effective, to be honest with you, back in 2014. This was their annexation. And when you talk about bridges, for all those bridges that Crimea is hitting, what's the one bridge that we're watching? That's going to be the Kerch Bridge, because that's the symbol of that takeover of Crimea that Vladimir Putin opened. Uh, I, it's going to be, the Kremlin, they're going to be loath to give up Crimea. In effect, they're going to order those folks to hold out as long as possible in terms of what the economic conditions are. So I think it's more of a gradual campaign. Now, Defense Minister Fedorov, smart guy, he might be right. They may be able to achieve it within weeks, and it will be basically by the time of the NATO summit, it may be cut off. I'm just more cautious, but I will say this from what you're hearing in Brussels is the direction of travel has shifted. Let's put it that way. And let's just repeat, if you and I are talking back in February, we're talking about Ukraine trying to hold out against all the Russian aerial attacks. We're talking about Ukraine in terms of the attacks on energy infrastructure. Now, here we are 4 months later, and we're talking about the Russians trying to hold out. And let's just add on top of this that not only is it the case that you're talking about isolating Crimea, you're hindering the movement of the Russian military through the occupied areas.
Joining me today is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome back to our program, Professor Lucas, and that's a pleasure to speak with you while I'm in Brussels covering NATO's ministerial.
Hello, Daniel. Good to see you from Belgium, and hello to everyone who's back in Ukraine.
Thanks, and as usual, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, World at Stake. We will record many much interview just soon. So let's begin our session with G7 summit this week, because Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky did attend the summit and met with US President Donald Trump. According to Financial Times, Trump is ready to impose another energy sanctions against Russian oil due to the fact that he is reaching a deal on Iran and global oil price is going down right now. Also, President Trump said today that he is considering providing Ukraine with license to produce missiles for US-made Patriot systems. Do you see this as a U-turn of President Trump? And is President Trump's position moving closer to Ukraine rather to Russia?
I think, Daniel, you and I have said before that Donald Trump is like a weather vane, and that he spends in the diplomatic breeze or whoever has just talked to him. Now, fortunately, on this occasion at the G7 in France, or the G6 plus one, to be more accurate, the prevailing breeze came not only from President Zelensky, it came from others at the summit, notably the French President Emmanuel Macron. So what is important with Trump? We'll talk about Trump officials in a minute, but what is important with Trump is not necessarily the substance of the proposal. because Trump doesn't know the details that well. It's the mood. It's the mood that you engage him with. And you and I have been discussing there was no bilateral Zelensky Trump meeting set up. And we were like, okay, maybe he's not in the mood to see Zelensky. Maybe Zelensky doesn't think it's quite right. But once it was arranged, whoever arranged it, for Emmanuel Macron to be in the room, so it was a trilateral meeting, then you get this breakthrough. The discussion is between Zelensky and Trump, but Macron is there to make it all work. And of course, just for a bit of context, remember that the French have put a great deal into flattering Trump's ego to make sure that he comes to the summit, he's happy, he doesn't leave early. So, for example, uh, on Wednesday night, you and I are uh, talking here on a Tuesday, but on Wednesday night, Macron is going to host Trump at the Palace of Versailles. Trump's 80th birthday, America's 250th anniversary. What matters is Trump feels like he's in all this richness and wealth and opulence. Macron sets this up. So now Zelensky, just like, and remember, you and I discussed this a few days ago. Remember the Vatican back in the spring of 2025 at Pope Francis's funeral, and Zelensky gets this 30 minutes of FaceTime with Trump, very carefully staged, and Macron was there at the time, I remember. Now you've done the same thing here. And so the Russians can't get to Trump. They can't say, oh, we're the victims, poor us, NATO is picking on us. Zelensky can say, look, we're under these aerial attacks. We have these issues with air defenses. We need help with the ballistic missiles. Let's talk about US licenses. At some point, Zelensky or Macron or other leaders at the summit, because there was a working meeting after this where Zelensky, Trump, and Macron joined the other leaders, they all say, well, okay, let's talk about getting those sanctions back on Russia because Trump is saying, I'll have a deal with Iran on Friday. Now, in fact, it's not quite a deal. That's another story we may pick up on. But the idea here is that the pretext for lifting the sanctions on Russia from March could be going away. Now, Trump will go back to Washington and he'll have these thoughts that have been put in his head, but then you have to make them happen. So it's going to be a matter of who you're talking to in terms of Trump officials. You've got to get Trump officials to keep this up with Trump, to talk about the sanctions, to talk about the air defenses. You know that real estate developer Steve Witkoff, the envoy, is not reliable because the Kremlin will manipulate him. You know that Jared Kushner is not reliable. I don't think Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, is necessarily reliable. I think if someone else says we have to put sanctions back on the Russians, he'll go along with it. We know that Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary, is not reliable. So who can you work on? So I'm not getting my hopes up too much. But that being said, I think something else was achieved at the G6+1. You have to make sure Trump doesn't get in the way of the support of others, by which I mean the Europeans, the Canadians were there as well, the Japanese, but of course, other countries were there as well. Remember, Gulf states were invited to this meeting. The Egyptians were there as well. You've got to make sure Trump doesn't get in the way of those other countries supporting Ukraine. So he doesn't come out and say, oh, Putin is the person that is the victim here. We need to focus on economic relations on Russia. You are wasting our money. We're not going to give you military aid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You want him to be on message that Ukraine's security is important. And if you do that, then the Europeans have this space that they're trying to fill, which is in the talks, because the Americans are out at this point, and they don't look like they're coming back in. So someone's got to broker the talks between Ukraine and Russia, and Europe is the most likely candidate for that role. You don't want Trump messing that up.
Let's also cover another interesting statements. We will get back to this, but Ukraine's defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, says that Crimea will become an island in the nearest future because it will be cut off by Ukrainian drone attacks, and Crimea will be isolated. During this NATO ministerial, I heard really optimistic statements by NATO officials, journalists, analysts about Ukraine's strikes against Russia's logistics and against this highway from occupied Crimea through the occupied territories to Russia. Don't you think that Crimea is becoming an uninhabitable place for Russian army and this is going out of Putin's control right now?
No, I don't want to make any predictions on that yet. I want to deal with what is and where we are with Crimea and with, again, as you know, with other Russian occupied areas of southern Ukraine. Uh, we Let me put this in a wider context, by the way, to say why I'm quite impressed with what Ukraine is doing, including under Defense Minister Fedorov. Um, Ukraine has gotten very specific in its targeting on refineries, on ports and terminals. We've talked about that. But what's then interesting is that they've gotten very specific in their targeting of bridges. So there's this systematic campaign. It's not just like, oh, we'll fire some missiles at a bridge and whatever. They're thinking through which bridges they want to hit. They're thinking through where the vulnerabilities are. So I think one of them, for example, was the Chonhar Bridge, right, which they have hit on several occasions. Now, there is one pro-Ukraine group, Crimean Wind, which says almost all the bridges are blown up and Crimea is already cut off. I need corroboration on that. I think what you have got from verified war monitors is that the traffic is way down between southern Russia, occupied southern Ukraine, and then Crimea. We also know from Crimean authorities, they're sounding a bit desperate now. Um, the gasoline rationing is now well in place with almost every gasoline or petrol station, if you will, across Crimea. That's 20 liters per week, 5.3 gallons. Uh, that's not enough for a lot of people to get by on a week-to-week basis. And that means anyone in Crimea is going to struggle to get out just because of the gasoline situation. We know that Russia is in discussions about how much they continue to relocate the Black Sea Fleet from Crimea to southern Russia, probably to Novorossiysk. That has been under discussion for some time. All of that being said, you have to remember how symbolically important Crimea is for the Kremlin. You know, this was the start of their war on Ukraine to be effective, to be honest with you, back in 2014. This was their annexation. And when you talk about bridges, for all those bridges that Crimea is hitting, what's the one bridge that we're watching? That's going to be the Kerch Bridge, because that's the symbol of that takeover of Crimea that Vladimir Putin opened. I It's going to be, the Kremlin, they're going to be loath to give up Crimea. In effect, they're going to order those folks to hold out as long as possible in terms of what the economic conditions are. So I think it's more of a gradual campaign. Now, Defense Minister Fedorov, smart guy, he might be right. They may be able to achieve it within weeks. And it will be basically by the time of the NATO summit, it may be cut off. I'm just more cautious, but I will say this from what you're hearing in Brussels is the direction of travel has shifted. Let's put it that way. And let's just repeat, if you and I are talking back in February, we're talking about Ukraine trying to hold out against all the Russian aerial attacks. We're talking about Ukraine in terms of the attacks on energy infrastructure. Now, here we are 4 months later, and we're talking about the Russians trying to hold out. And let's just add on top of this that not only is it the case that you're talking about isolating Crimea, you're hindering the movement of the Russian military through the occupied areas. The Russians have already stalled out on the front lines of Zaporizhia. Ukraine has taken some territory back there. I don't think we're talking about a military operation to cut off Crimea. I think it's going to be primarily this tactic to cut off the logistics and supply. But it also means the Ukrainian military is going to have a bit more room to maneuver against a Russian military that's trying to struggle to hold its positions.
Meanwhile, a senior NATO official told me that there is growing discontent in the Kremlin and among Russian elites. They are asking about this war and they're wondering whether this was worth it. And they're also saying that Putin is personally responsible for this disaster, not the Russian government officials or business elites. What could this mean and how could this influence Putin's negotiating position, his negotiating hand?
It's one thing for Russian officials to say this quietly or to get it whispered where all of a sudden a NATO official picks up on it through whatever intelligence sources they have. It's another thing for Russians to say this openly. And, we just have to be very honest about that. What can what can we see that is already happening though? We can already see not just Russian businessmen, uh, Russian officials who could be worried about the state of the economy. We've got the Kremlin itself admitting it. I mean, when you get the deputy prime minister, when you get Alexander Novak saying, yeah, the drone attacks are having an effect on our energy supplies, when you get Putin himself acknowledging that the drone attacks are having an effect, which he has finally done, when you get the finance minister telling Russian ministries that they have to cut back on their spending because it all has to be devoted to the special military operation, the invasion, when you have that spending now taking what military and security spending is what now that more than 40% of Russia's government budget. I think that's where we are. You know, we don't have to go to whispers to see where the crunch is starting to come in. But it's a much different matter for this to be, all right, Mr. Putin, that's it. We've got to halt. We've got to cease fire. You have to realize that the day that Putin ceasefire, it's not just that he's lost the attempt to conquer Ukraine, he's lost inside Russia. He staked his entire political future, however long it's going to be, for a man in his 70s, that he would take over Ukraine. The day he ceases fire, you can't cover that up with spin. You can't cover up by talking about the Donetsk People's Republic, the Luhansk People's Republic. I if you read the Russian business papers, the Russian economic papers, you know there's discontent. But that's where you're going to see it. You're going to see it in terms of people getting worried about the conditions they're operating under rather than a direct challenge to the Kremlin. Sorry, I mean, that's just the way it has to be. You know, we just have to add one other fact. The one rebellion against Putin that we can mark out was 2023. That was Wagner, the Wagner group, and Yevgeny Prigozhin. We know that it was successful in the initial hours. We know that the Kremlin is weak, but we also know that when Prigozhin blanked, when he allowed himself to go into talks with Putin, we saw what Putin could do. He could manipulate Prigozhin where he could push back the rebellion, and then he could wind up killing Prigozhin a few months later. You know, so that's the type of operator we're dealing with. And I don't think I don't think you should underestimate Putin's tenacity, and also the fact that we really don't have, where's the Russian figure? Where's the Russian figure who stabs him in the back? Not Lavrov, you know, not the defense minister, not Belousov, right? Probably not Shoigu. So where is that figure?
Let's also get back to US-Ukraine relations and these talks, because President Trump right now makes lots of statements on Ukraine. He says that Putin should make a deal, and he will try. He says that both Putin and Zelensky would like to meet each other, but they don't know how to do that. Uh, do you expect any kind of new push from President Trump, and can he really force Putin to participate at least in serious negotiations right now, or is it a hopeless situation for US because US doesn't have any kind of leverage over Russia?
I don't see it happening at the moment because Marco Rubio said, look, we're leaving the building. You know, we discussed that before a couple of weeks ago. Rubio said, look, the talks aren't progressing. That's it. We're out. If the talks make progress, then we'll come back in. But there's one thing I watch. I mean, I think the Russians are hoping to host Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner again. You know, real estate developer Steve Witkoff, Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, who will not visit Kyiv, still won't step foot in Kyiv, but they're probably going back to Russia to see their pal Kirill Dmitriev. Now, we know what the risk is here. We talked earlier in this conversation about Trump spinning like a weather vane. Witkoff and Kushner get manipulated by Dmitriev. They get told all about the economic future for the US and Russia to work together. We get talking about a post-Gulf future where Russia and the United States can cooperate on energy projects, infrastructure projects. They come back, but we have to settle Ukraine, which means you have to give us what we want. And Witkoff comes back yet again and tells Trump, oh, we need to give them all of the Donbass, and then we'll have this economic partnership. That's the risk. I mean, I can't see the Americans coming back into the talks as a neutral mediator, if you want to make that. Because I don't think Witkoff and Kushner can fill that role. Maybe if Rubio was willing to do it, then Rubio comes in, but he would have to step up to come in and do it. And I think right now there's a big story right now about the rivalry between Marco Rubio and JD Vance over their political futures, which is playing out over the Iran war. And so I think Marco's preoccupied with that. And Marco may also be preoccupied with Cuba because I'm not ruling out the Americans make a big push against Cuba, given that they failed in Iran. So Keith Kellogg's no longer there. You don't have that envoy that was there in Ukraine. You satisfied. Who else from the American side comes in to reboot the talks?
Let's also cover Iran deal, because President Trump is due to sign this deal probably today or tomorrow. He also said that this deal has already been signed electronically. What is your assessment of these terms? Because Iran would receive probably an access to a $300 billion fund. Don't you think that this sounds like a huge humiliation for US and big success for the Iranian regime? Because Iranians will use this as a demonstration of strength of the regime and will just strengthen their grip on power in Iran.
I have to hope you have a few minutes for a story because we need to tell a story here to get this out. 4 words to start this story. It's not a deal. They'll call it a memorandum of understanding, but the Iranians and the US are giving different versions of what is in that 14-point document. Now, we do know what's in that document now, and I'll tell you that story in a second. But remember, the Trump administration has not officially released it. And here's the reason why they won't release it. On Sunday, the main effort of everybody, because I was watching this, I was covering the story, and I was watching whether or not Iran would retaliate against Israel. Israel had attacked Lebanon, had attacked Beirut yet again. The mediators, the Qatari mediators, were preoccupied with the Iranians, trying to make sure the Iranians did not retaliate. They also hopefully could then discuss advancing the draft document, and I emphasize the draft document. In the middle of this, on Sunday afternoon, Washington time, Donald Trump goes on social media and says, I've signed the deal. He says, I've digitally signed it. We now know through officials who went and talked to the Wall Street Journal, Trump did not consult senior advisors before he put out that message. The senior advisors were not aware that Trump was going to sign. That means that Trump was not signing a confirmed document agreed between the US and Iran. He was signing a working draft. Now, why he did that, we can only speculate. Was he feeling domestic pressure? Did he want to influence the oil and the stock markets on Monday morning? Was it because on Sunday night he had his 80th birthday party with an Ultimate Fighting Championship cage match on the White House lawn? Possibly all of that was involved. What it means is that Trump handed the Iranians the initiative again. 2 months ago, when the Iranians first put out their 14-point document, Trump gave them the initiative by saying, we'll negotiate on the basis of this. That gave the Iranians leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. Now, what has Trump done? Al Arabiya, the Saudi outlet, was the first one to publish the draft yesterday. And I immediately got on to folks that I know, because I know a lot about Al Arabiya. I know, they're a Saudi state outlet. I know where their sources come from, and I double checked who the sources are. So I know the source, and it's a neutral source. It's not an American, it's not an Iranian who told them. Now Bloomberg has the story, and it's run. Those 14 points say, all right, Iran will reopen the Strait of Hormuz within 30 days, but it's not going to be like it was before the start of the war. It's not under international, it's open to all. Iran and the Iranians hope Oman will oversee this. Now, what does Iran get in return? You've mentioned the $300 billion. It's now being framed as a private investment fund. So the American government doesn't have to put any money into it, but they encourage private investors to put money into it. And an official is saying that over half of that fund has already been pledged. That will be 150 billion already pledged. Secondly, the Americans get rid of sanctions. Those sanctions that Trump ripped up the document in 2000, he ripped up the nuclear deal in 2015 to put on maximum sanctions in 2018. Now those go. In addition, the U.S. gets rid of UN resolutions and International Atomic Energy Agency resolutions that criticize the Iranians. In addition to that, the Americans help with an undisclosed amount of Iranian frozen assets, of frozen and Iranian assets being released. The number 24 billion is circulating. All of that in return for opening up the Strait of Hormuz. And then just add two other things. The Iranians don't have to discuss the nuclear issue until further on in the process, in what is effectively a second stage. And the Iranians also are saying there's a ceasefire on all fronts, including Israel's attacks on Lebanon. Now, Daniel, you go through all of that and you tell me which of those terms means the U.S. is in a better position than it was on February 26th when it was talking to the Iranians 2 days before the start of the war. The Strait of Hormuz was open then. Iran was willing to discuss limits on its nuclear program. It might even discuss limits on its ballistic missiles, its relations with Lebanon's Hezbollah, the Yemen's Houthis. The Iranians were willing to discuss phase sanctions relief. The Iranians were not demanding 300 billion in reconstruction funds. So tell me how the Trump folks are better off out of this. And that's what's going to make Friday's ceremony interesting. Because either the Trump folks have to publish the document and they have to have those 14 points now set out there publicly and they can't try to spend them, or they have to walk away from it. That's the only two options they've got at this point.
Thanks, Professor Lucas, for these insights and short but really insightful interview. So probably historians will judge and have their own judgment with this outcome, probably with this war, if we can say it or analyze it as an outcome yet. And glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Now go enjoy Brussels for the both of us.